This is the first big global pandemic after 1918 influenza epidemic. The world is unprepared in spite of repeated warnings. This is the cycle we have repeated through 2003 SARS epidemic, swine flu, avian flu, Zika, Nipah, and Ebola. The prophetic words of the Global Preparedness Monitoring Board, co-convened by WHO and World Bank September 2019. For too long, we have allowed a cycle of panic and neglect when it comes to pandemics. We ramp up efforts when there is a serious threat, then quickly forget about them when the threat subsides. It is well past time to act. There is a very real threat of a rapidly moving, highly lethal pandemic of a respiratory pathogen killing 50 to 80 million people and wiping out nearly 5% of the world's economy. A global pandemic on that scale would be catastrophic, creating widespread havoc, instability, and insecurity. The world is not prepared. As on 10th August, SARS-CoV-2 has infected 20 million people and killed more than 700,000. It shows no sign of abating. We have seen the herd immunity disaster in UK and Sweden, and that of ignoring the epidemic by the US and Brazil. Only vaccines and drugs, if we discover an effective treatment, can help us. Herd immunity can come only from vaccines. Experts expect vaccines to be available by beginning of next year. A number of medicines are being repurposed and are in clinical trials. So far, only 2 have shown some efficacy. Vaccines and drugs may be available, but will they reach the people? We already know the US approach. Warp Speed's main goal is to protect the United States. The attitude here is the oxygen mask approach, the official says. Swaminathan has cautioned us against vaccine nationalism. Yet money and national interest may win out. The United States and Europe are placing advance orders for hundreds of millions of doses of successful vaccines, potentially leaving little for poorer parts of the world. Will we see a repeat of the AIDS scenario where 15% of children in Uganda had been orphaned by the disease and more than 35% of adults in Botswana were infected? But the 3-drug antiretroviral cocktail necessary to treat the disease then cost a whopping $10,000 to $15,000 per person annually. In the 13th International AIDS Conference in Durban, South African High Court Justice Edwin Cameron denounced the shocking and monstrous iniquity of the global trading system that failed to provide dying AIDS patients in poor countries with affordable treatment options. Thanks to CIPLA and Indian patent laws, generic AIDS medicines were available at $350 and thousands of lives were saved. These are the 92 countries covered by WHO COVAX vaccine facility. There are low income, lower middle income, and additional IDA eligible countries. If vaccine costs around $3 a shot, $6 billion will get us 1 billion doses. Gavi has only raised $600 million and is targeting to raise $6 billion. This will cover only 1 billion out of 7.5 billion of the world's population. So what about the rest? This will not cover most parts of Latin America and the poor and rich countries who will get the drugs at market prices. There are a series of questions that crop up. How do we make vaccines available to all for years to come, for all the 7.5 billion people? Vaccines may only give you short-term immunity, so what about vaccines for everyone every year? And now the US buys up 3 months' stock worth of remdesivir. So then, why can't we break Gilead's patent? Doha Declaration of 2001, as well as patent laws of most countries, allow them to break patents under epidemics and health emergencies. Why can't we?
Hello. Welcome to the second session of a discussion series organized by NewsClick in collaboration with Brazil de Fato, PATV Ghana, and People's Dispatch on COVID-19 pandemic and our challenges. Why do we think intellectual property related issues are relevant in the current pandemic? That's the question that we are trying to look at. So before that, let's very briefly consider the SARS-CoV-2 virus causing the illness COVID-19. In the last 8 months, the pandemic has affected more than 20 million individuals and has caused more than 700,000 deaths globally. The infection is still spreading in most of the countries, and majority of those who are infected remain without symptoms. Thus, their immune response is dealing really well with the infection. A minority of the people do fall sick and need medical help, oxygen supply, ventilators, or ICU-based care. There is a large proportion of population which is not infected with the virus yet and hence remains susceptible. If effective vaccines become available, they will help in generating virus-specific immunity in the recipients. This immune response is likely to last for a long time and hence provide protection from future exposure to the virus. The critical question in today's context is, as and when vaccines become available, who will have access to them? Since limited number of vaccine doses will be available, at least to begin with, how will priorities be decided? Will money, affordability be the primary considerations? And hence, will poor people from the developing countries be denied access to vaccines? Will the real needy people who are in the high-risk categories, such as doctors, paramedics, elderly people, people with comorbidities, and so on, be given priority? What are the ways in which vaccine access can be and should be regulated? Today's panelists will discuss this issue. Kajal, will you elaborate first on whether there is really a problem with intellectual property in COVID-19? And if so, what dimensions has it taken? And it will also be good if you could comment on access to vaccines in India, since India has such a huge manufacturing capacity. Kajal.
I think for those of us working on IP and access to medicines, the minute the pandemic was announced and the WHO announced the international emergency, we, of course, immediately knew that there were going to be barriers when it came to new medicines. The focus on repurposing existing medicines also meant that we would be seeing what we have become very familiar with as a tactic from Big Pharma, which is called the evergreening of patents. This is a tactic used by Big Pharma to file for patent applications and patents on new uses and new forms of existing medicines. And indeed, with drugs like remdesivir, we are starting to see multiple patent applications in many, many developing countries, which are playing a big role in impeding access to this drug in many of those countries. But also over the last decade and a half, having worked on treated agreements and seeing the amount of pressure developed countries put on our countries to expand IP, we've also got a sense of how truly expansive intellectual property has become. And I think that is becoming more and more obvious in the public domain as well. The first realization of this probably came when news reports emerged about Italian volunteers and researchers who were trying to help out a hospital by 3D printing valves that were used for ventilators so that they could be used for more patients. And they approached the company that was not able to keep up with the valve production and said, share your blueprints with us so that we can make these the valves. And of course, the company refused to share the blueprints, and understandably so. They sell a valve for over 10,000 euros, and the 3D printing brought the price down to €1. These Italian researchers did actually make those valves. It did help the hospitals. But I think what was really worrying to see this refusal to share technology and blueprints was it came at a time when Italy was so hard hit that, page after page in newspapers were covered with obituaries. And yet it was commercial interest that, didn't allow the sharing of this very simple technology and solution to a shortage problem. Then we got the news of this standoff that was happening between the Dutch government and Roche, which was supplying tests to them for COVID-19. Roche had said that they could not keep up with demand and were in fact telling the government that, you should limit your testing only to the symptomatic, something that I think we've all dealt with in many countries, this limitation of testing, and we know what a problem that creates. And they basically the Dutch government wanted access to the recipe for the testing fluid that was used in Roche's test. And Roche tried their best to keep the recipe a secret, and eventually the European Competition Authority threatened to step in, and they finally shared the recipe. So this recipe for the fluid isn't actually patented, but suddenly I think in the public domain, this idea of what are trade secrets, Coke's recipe, for instance, is a trade secret. What does this mean and how expansive it is? And I think we are also starting to learn what a great concern this issue of trade secrets is starting to become in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. In terms of patents on diagnostic tests, we had a most peculiar response from the Indian Council of Medical Research in India when the epidemic just started. There was a case in the Supreme Court asking for all testing, both in the public and the private sector, to be free of cost. And the ICMR put in an affidavit saying that, well, most of our tests are currently imported, several parts are patented, so we won't be able to make it domestically, so bringing down the price is going to be difficult. Now, this was quite interesting, and ICMR never really did clarify what they meant by these patented parts of the tests or how domestic producers of tests have now got around that. And I think that's an interesting question for Indian advocates to pursue at a later stage. But it seemed to play a role in a pricing cap on tests rather than making testing freely available in the private sector. There's, of course, the story of the N95 masks, which I think is now, I think well known to everyone. One of the biggest producers in the world is a company called 3M. They hold hundreds of patents on mask designs. But most importantly, they're very aggressive enforcers of these patents. They have also enforced these patents in India against a local manufacturer called Venus, where they went through a very lengthy litigation against a patent, N95 mask design to get an injunction against the company. So I think what we started to realize is there's a range of intellectual property that can directly or indirectly impact COVID-19. I think since vaccines are foremost on everyone's minds, and let me be upfront, it's an issue that I'm only starting to deal with, and it's extremely complicated. There's this big question on whether patents on vaccines can actually impact access and production. And I think for the longest time, if you go into literature, there was this notion that actually IP is not so much of a concern with vaccines. It's the processing technology, it's the regulatory landscape, and that's what inhibits how competitors come into the field. But I think research over as we lurched from one infectious outbreak to another, whether it was SARS or H1N1 or MERS, there's been more research to show that this is an extremely naive view of the role that IP plays when it comes to vaccines. There was a recent study in Nature that also looked at the patenting activity on mRNA vaccines, which is the newer sort of vaccine, which I think we will see new outcomes. I think it's the first time we will see mRNA vaccines in COVID-19. And they looked at the level of patenting and found 113 patent families. They found that Moderna, CureVac, BioNTech, and GSK collectively own nearly half of the patent applications, and these are also the companies that are pursuing these candidates. And there's an increasing filing that's happening in multiple countries on these vaccines.
Thanks, Kajal. I'll ask Lorena to sort of make a comparison. So what differences do you perceive in the access to vaccines in Latin America as compared to the picture, somewhat global, but also somewhat India specific, that Kajal already highlighted? And what are the differences between capabilities in Argentina, where you are from, and the other Latin American countries?
For us, the most important experience that we have is working with access to medicines, because we started working on HIV and also on hepatitis C with a different logic of the COVID-19 pandemic is showing us. So we were used to be concerned about the sustainability of our treatments, because we have to take the treatment every day. So this is why we started working on patents that are blocking the access and production and accessibility of the medicines. Well, the world of the vaccines is a bit new for us, because as I explained, in HIV there is no vaccine available, and maybe this is the logic that the companies that really have the power in this patent system that is globalized, and every part of the world we have the same problems. The companies didn't have any interest to develop vaccines for HIV, because they prefer us. They don't want us healthy. They don't want us dead. They want us with illnesses and with a chronic treatment. So this is new, and we have really facing challenges in order to adequate our capacity to work as civil society the access to vaccines. We are doing a research, and we have found that there are at least 119 patents that are related to the clinical trials. Basically, these vaccines started the clinical trials for other illnesses, or with SARS, with MERS, and Ebola. And that's why we have an advanced stage of the clinical trials, because with months it is impossible to reach to a treatment or to a vaccine. So we have to highlight that the proximity of having a really effective treatment or vaccine is because we have a lot of research on medicines with a broad spectrum. And in Latin America, we have a strong capacity to produce, especially in Brazil, in Argentina. And Argentina is a key source to export for the region. Also, Colombia has a strong private sector to produce medicines and vaccines. But in this framework, the patents are of great concern because they block the local production. And most of these health technologies are coming from United States or from Europe or from Japan. And I mean, what we have in our countries here are patents that are foreign patents. It's not a local patent. So this means that we have really a concern when patent application is filed in our patent office. Also, an important thing to understand Argentina patent system is that we have what we call patentability guidelines. That is a measure that was adopted in 2012, and it has a rigorous system for patent examination, and it determines which patent applications are eligible to grant a patent and what not. These patentability guidelines are attacked by Big Pharma. A joint is a chamber of multinational companies are attacking in a judicial case these patentability guidelines. So they want to weakness our system. As civil society, we identified some years ago, and we started with this opposition work that is in the TRIPS agreement. Is a health safeguard, very important from the point of view of civil society, is in the TRIPS agreement, but also is in our national law. That is the possibility of third parties to participate and collaborate during the patent examination. Mostly to give arguments and also proofs that patent application is not meeting the patentability requirement. This is a very important tool that we have been using for HIV, for example, and also for hepatitis C. And the most important objective of this, or using this instrument, is to have a market without patents, so we can produce locally. The problem with when we have a patent granted is that we must depend on international procurement and on the prices, the high prices that the companies who hold a patent want to sell their products.
Let me move on to asking Prabir a little more, to provide us with a little more historical perspective. So how would you describe the developments linked to WTO and TRIPS and countries going back and forth on their promises globally?
You know, when we were young, infectious diseases were around, at least in our countries, though in the West it somehow had started waning. but infectious disease is very much a part of our lives. And therefore, patents under which India operated, and so did most of the what would be called today developing countries. At that time, we were still in the colonial phase. At that period, we suffered from what would be called colonial patent laws, which persisted even after countries became free. And it was a 25-year struggle in India to free the Indian public sector as well as the private sector from the patent regime. And we did away with that time product patents. This was also done in Latin America. Latin America also at that virtually in the same period did away with product patents. They only permitted process patents. And the prices of drugs, which according to an American congressional committee was the highest in India. At that time in that committee's report, they examined about, I think, 35 countries. We were the poorest in that list. The drug prices in India for antibiotics used against infectious diseases, we were the highest. So all that changed. And we got into finally a situation where we could produce drugs in sufficient amounts and also at prices that people could afford till we got to the TRIPS agreement and we saw a reversal of that. We thought we had won that battle with the AIDS epidemic and the fact that in Doha 2001, in the Doha Declaration, there was an acceptance that in a health emergency or in a epidemic, patents could be broken and countries could be allowed to produce without the patentee's approval if required. And they could even ask companies in other parts of the world to produce for them, even if that country did not place that order. They themselves could place the order in that country. So it was possible for Indian companies, for instance, to produce drugs for other countries. Now, this today we seem to have reversed again. And here it's not a question of the laws. It's really a question of the political will of the countries and whether the health authorities of countries are willing to fight those who are the patent holders and those countries which are backing patents. Let's be very clear. It is not the companies we are fighting. It's also the countries which are behind the patent holders. For instance, a lot of examples have been given. Let me give another example. Well, Bayer's Nexavar patent was actually a compulsory license was issued in 2012 in India. Bayer said that this is theft, that we didn't make these drugs for Indians. We made it for rich Western patients who could afford it. So it might be a life-saving drug, but if you're poor and you can't afford it, too bad. That was Bayer's CEO statement. Now, after that, the US trade body got into what is called the USTR, the Trade Representative's Office got into the act. India was threatened that if you do any other compulsory licensing, you're ahead. So after that, we haven't issued any other compulsory licensing. Even today, when you're talking about vaccines and medicines, whether it's remdesivir or whether it is the vaccines, the question is it possible for those patents to hold under the current conditions of pandemic and what is accepted by every country as a health emergency? Even Mr. Trump seems to have accepted it. I think the only exception is Bolsonaro. So having accepted all of this, is it possible for the law to be implemented that the patents will be worked and the public cannot get access to vaccines or medicine? The answer is no. There is no legal bar. That I think has already been cleared. Whether it's Argentina, whether it's India, whether it is most countries in the world have the provision for compulsory licensing. This is there in almost every country's laws. And as I said, the Doha Declaration, WTO has also accepted, yes, this is there and countries can do this. The question is, why aren't we doing it? Why is it that we still want to operate under the patent regime? Why is it that 3M is, even if it fails, why are compulsory licensing not being made available to others? You have the details also in the patent application. So it's easy to replicate it. There's no rocket science in making masks, for Christ's sake. So when you don't do this, that means you are afraid to buck the big brother United States and its trade regime. So that's where we are coming from today. It's not a legal bar that we are really talking about. It's a political bar that we are facing, and the unwillingness of the developing countries to get together and say, okay, we don't recognize this. Let us exchange knowledge among ourselves and see how we can do this. Now, when it comes to vaccines, you are absolutely right that vaccines are the only solution at the moment to large-scale protection against the pandemic. There's no question that's the only thing that's going to do what is called herd immunity. India, as well as countries like Argentina, as well as countries like Brazil, have the infrastructure to produce the vaccine, have the science and technology resources available in terms of human beings to be able to replicate a successful vaccine. They don't really have to ask. Once you know that this is a successful vaccine, duplicating it is much easier. So if that is possible, then the only question is, do you have the science and technological infrastructure to reproduce that vaccine in your country and supply to all other parts of the world? And the answer is yes again, provided you have the political will to do it and make the investments possible. Let's also look at what are the costs of what we are talking about. If we take a $3 a vaccine, which is what the price that is being talked of, what Serum Institute has talked about, that's what their price cap is going to be. Then for 7.5 billion people, population of the world, you are talking of something like $22.5 billion. It might sound big for you and me sitting on this table, because after all, 22.5 billion is a very large number. But look at the kind of losses that the global economy is facing. It's in trillions. Even India is talking about something like $265 billion of bailout that the current pandemic is going to cause them to give. So when you're talking of this scale of bailouts, what is $22.5 billion? It's really nothing. So why is it that we are not planning for it, and we are expecting the Gavi WHO program, which I think Kajal can tell us more about, to bail the world out? They are planning for 1 billion doses in the first year of their operation, and they require $10 billion for the program. I think they have raised 600 billion, and the plan to get about $2 billion. Maybe they'll reach $10 billion, but even if they do, it's only 1 billion doses they are talking about, and it will not be available, for instance, for large parts of Latin America who are not covered as the least developed countries. They don't fall below $4,000 or per capita income, which is the benchmark that has been set. So given all of this, I think we need a movement of the people, articulation of these demands that must come in the world, that we need to prepare for vaccines, and neither patent nor political barriers should be there against countries to do these, make these vaccines, and prepare the infrastructure right from today.
We are likely to face even more pandemics in the future because we are encroaching the so-called jungles and the ecosystem of the birds and beasts, so that the zoonotic diseases, as we call them, this also, as it happens, the COVID-19 also is a zoonotic disease which has reached human beings. So more such zoonotic diseases are likely to reach us. This is not trying to frighten anybody, but this is sort of saying that this may not be the last pandemic, especially the young ones may see another one. And I hope we don't have to reinvent the wheel on the patents and IP issues, and we might have a better world tomorrow. I'm not necessarily saying that's going to happen, but one can hope for that. And with that, I thank Kajal, Lorena, Probir for giving wonderful answers, and we will stop the session there. Thank you very much.